The advertisement said the town needed a teacher and the rancher needed a wife. I could provide both. It promised. I told myself it was practical, not desperate. Boston had nothing left for me. I stepped off the stagecoach into Montana Territory dust with one trunk and a teaching certificate that felt increasingly worthless. The main street stretched empty before me, buildings baking under afternoon sun. A few horses stood tied at hitching posts. No people, no children. Nothing like the bustling eastern towns I'd known. Mrs. Henderson met me at the boarding house. A round woman with kind eyes and flour on her apron. She showed me to a small room overlooking the street, helped me carry my trunk upstairs, then delivered the blow over tea. Oh, honey, that schoolhouse has been empty 2 years now. I set down my cup carefully. Empty. Children work the ranches. Families can't spare them during planting, harvest, winter feeding. School was built with Eastern money. Eastern ideas? She said it gently. But I heard the criticism underneath. Another Easterner who didn't understand the West. She walked me to the schoolhouse after tea. I needed to see it, though part of me wanted to stay ignorant just a little longer. The building stood perfect on the edge of town, fresh white paint, glass windows catching sunlight, a sturdy door with a brass lock. Through the windows, I could see unused desks arranged in neat rows, a chalkboard without a single mark, shelves waiting for books. Dust motes danced in the afternoon light, undisturbed for months, maybe years. It's a beautiful building, Mrs. Henderson said, just no students to fill it. I pressed my hand against the glass. Everything I'd imagined, empty of everything I needed. That evening, I unpacked my trunk in the small boarding house room. Mother's books came out first, McGuffey readers, primers, slate tablets, a worn copy of Emerson's essays. I'd studied teaching at the Boston Library after Mother died. Spent 2 years preparing, believing education was my calling. My escape from a life that had no place for plain. Aging women with no family and no prospects. I touched each book like a talisman. In Boston, these had represented purpose. Here, they seemed like artifacts from another world. I studied my reflection in the small mirror above the washstand. 32 years old. Unremarkable features, brown hair pulled back severely, gray eyes that had seen better days, a mouth that had forgotten how to smile easily, capable hands, though strong hands. Was that enough for a rancher who needed a wife? Mother had died in winter. By spring, I'd worn out my welcome with distant cousins who'd taken me in out of obligation rather than affection. Boston had no need for spinster schoolteachers with no connections. The advertisement had appeared in the newspaper like salvation disguised as practicality. Rancher seeks educated wife. Town seeks teacher. One woman could provide both. I'd answered the same day. Now, standing in a Montana boarding house with a trunk full of useless books. I wondered if I should leave before meeting him. The rancher. My future husband in contract only. Spare us both the disappointment, but where would I go? Boston had closed its door. This one hadn't opened yet. I existed in the space between. Neither here nor there. Belonging nowhere. Through my window, I could see the schoolhouse in the distance. Windows dark. A perfect building with no purpose. I understood the feeling. The rancher would arrive tomorrow. I spent that first night wondering which would disappoint him more, my plain face or my useless profession. Both felt equally inadequate. Morning arrived with harsh sunlight and Mrs. Henderson calling up the stairs. "He's here, dear." My hands shook as I smoothed my dress. I'd chosen the gray one practical, modest, appropriate for a woman who'd come west to work, rather than charm. In the mirror, I looked exactly like what I was a spinster schoolteacher trying to convince herself this was a good decision. He stood in the boarding house parlor, hat in his rough hands, looking more nervous than I'd expected. Thomas Merrick. Not handsome, but solid, real, weathered face that spoke of years outdoors, kind eyes the color of summer sky, work-worn hands that had built the life he was offering to share. He didn't stare at me the way I'd feared. Didn't assess me like livestock being evaluated. Miss Thornton, he nodded. Formal and careful. I hope your journey was comfortable. As comfortable as 3 days on a stagecoach can be. Mr. Merrick. We sat across from each other in Mrs. Henderson's parlor. She'd set out coffee and disappeared tactfully. The cup rattled slightly when I lifted it. Both of us were fulfilling obligations, neither pretending this was romance. I appreciated his honesty even as it highlighted the transactional nature of our arrangement. Tell me about your family, he said. There's no one left. Mother died 2 years ago. No siblings. Distant cousins in Boston who... I stopped. No need to explain how unwelcome I'd become. I taught at a small school for young ladies. That is, until it closed. He nodded. Didn't press. Asked about my journey instead. The countryside I'd seen. Whether I'd ever been west before. Safe questions. Polite questions. The kind you ask strangers you might spend your life with. Finally, he addressed the problem directly. Mrs. Henderson told you about the school. She did. I'm sorry. I know that must be disappointing. He set down his coffee. The family's here. They need their children for ranch work. Harvest demands, winter feeding, spring planting. It's not that they don't value education. They just can't spare the labor. I heard the edge in my voice, tried to soften it. Education wasn't a luxury. It was a necessity. But I held my tongue. I needed this position. Needed somewhere to belong. He looked at me then. Really looked. And I saw something in his eyes I hadn't expected. Understanding. Maybe even loneliness. I'd like to show you the land tomorrow, if you're willing, he said. Let you see what you'd be coming into. He paused, choosing words carefully. And I think you should keep your room here at the boarding house until you're comfortable with the arrangement. No pressure for immediate marriage. The kindness undid me more than criticism would have. I'd prepared myself for a hard man, someone who'd view a wife as property and a teacher as hired help. Instead, he seemed lonely, like me. 2 people building lives that hadn't filled with the warmth they'd planned for. That's very generous. Mr. Merrick. Thomas, he said quietly. And it's not generous. It's fair. This arrangement should suit both of us, not just me. He stood to leave, settled his hat carefully. At the door. He paused and mentioned almost casually. Most of my ranch hands can't read their own names. They sign contracts with X marks. Some have families back east they can't write to. He met my eyes. That schoolhouse doesn't have to stay empty. Miss Thornton just might need different students than you planned for. After he left, I sat with cooling coffee, turning his words over and over. Different students. I was still thinking like a Bostonian, still imagining education as children's primers and slates arranged in neat rows. The West, apparently, had other ideas. I recognized the careful distance in his politeness. We were 2 strangers navigating a transaction that might become intimacy or might stay forever cordial and separate. I couldn't decide which frightened me more. Thomas returned 3 days later with a detailed proposal. We sat in the same boarding house parlor. But this time, he'd brought papers, a schedule he'd sketched out. A list of potential students. Estimates of how many might attend. Evening classes for ranch hands. He explained 3 nights a week. After work. Afternoon sessions for ranchers' wives when they can spare the time. And flexible day classes for any children whose families can spare them. Even if just for an hour here and there. My immediate reaction was resistance. That's not proper schooling. Adults need different methods than children. I wasn't trained for... He interrupted gently. You were trained to teach reading. Weren't you? The rest is just timing. I wanted to argue. This wasn't the dignified classroom I'd imagined. Wasn't the ordered world of primers and recitations and children progressing through grades. But he was offering me purpose, and I was starving for purpose. Let me show you the ranch, he said. Meet the men, then decide. We rode out in his wagon under wide Montana sky. The land stretched endlessly, grass rippling like water, mountains distant and snow-capped. Beautiful and brutal. I'd never seen space like this. Boston felt cramped in comparison, all buildings and narrow streets and people pressed together. His ranch spread across a valley barn, corrals, bunkhouse, main house sitting solid against the wind. 5 cowboys worked in the near corral, breaking a young horse to saddle. They stopped when we approached, eyeing me with the same nervous curiosity I felt toward them. Thomas introduced me to each one. Marcus, graying and weathered, had worked the ranch for 12 years. He mentioned a son back east almost apologetically. Haven't written him in 3 years, Marcus said. Can't write. He probably thinks I forgot him. Something shifted in my chest. These weren't students. These were fathers who couldn't write to their children. Men who'd signed contracts without understanding the terms. Human beings trapped by illiteracy in ways I'd never fully understood. I'll teach you, I heard myself say. If you want to learn, Marcus's face transformed. Yes, ma'am. I surely would. On the ride back to town, Thomas laid out the practical details. I could live in the small teacher's cottage behind the schoolhouse. He'd provide supplies, lamp oil, whatever I needed. The town would pay my teaching salary. Marriage could wait until I was certain. I noticed what he didn't say, that he'd already decided to help. Already committed to supporting this vision, whether I married him or not. The decency of it frightened me almost as much as it touched me. 1 month, I agreed. Trial period. Evening classes 3 nights weekly, starting with basic literacy. He smiled for the first time since I'd met him. That's all I ask. I moved into the teacher's cottage 2 days later. It was small, 1 room with a stove, a bed, a table, and a rocking chair someone had left behind. But it had windows facing east toward sunrise. And it was mine. Not the boarding house, not his ranch house. Mine, a space between obligation and commitment where I could catch my breath. The schoolhouse waited across the dusty yard. I walked over that afternoon with the brass key Mrs. Henderson had given me, hands trembling slightly. The lock resisted, then turned. The door swung open on hinges that creaked from disuse. Dust everywhere. Afternoon light slanting through windows, illuminating rows of empty desks, the unmarked chalkboard, shelves waiting for books. I'd planned for children's primers. Instead, I set up slates and chalk for grown men who worked cattle all day. That first evening, 7 cowboys arrived at sunset with scrubbed hands and nervous eyes. They sat in desks built for children, knees folded awkwardly, hats in laps. I'd never seen grown men look so vulnerable. We're going to start with your names. I told them, each of you will learn to write your own name tonight. Marcus went first. I guided his hand, showed him how to form the letters, Marcus. His entire hand trembled as he traced it. When he finished, he stared at the slate like he'd discovered gold. That's my name, he whispered. That's me, written down. Watching them bent over slates, tongues between teeth in concentration. I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Purpose. Real purpose. Not the imagined kind I'd constructed in Boston libraries. This was teaching. Not the version I'd planned for, but the version that mattered. I'd built teaching in my mind as neat rows of children, alphabet songs, copybooks, and recitations. The West was dismantling that image, replacing it with something I didn't yet understand, but couldn't quite dismiss. That first evening, 7 men learned to write their names. I learned that education wasn't about the students I'd planned for. It was about the ones who appeared. 3 weeks passed in a rhythm I hadn't expected. Evening classes grew to 12 men. 4 ranchers' wives joined afternoon sessions, Mrs. Henderson among them, determined to learn household accounting at age 56. Small victories accumulated like snowfall, quiet and steady. Marcus read his first complete sentence, "The cow is brown." Simple words, but he beamed like a child. Sarah Mitchell, a rancher's wife with 3 children, learned to cipher well enough to balance household accounts. "My husband always handled the money," she told me. "Said I didn't need to worry my head. Now I know exactly where every penny goes." The schoolhouse transformed from pristine emptiness to lived-in warmth. Slates stacked on shelves showed progress marks. The chalkboard bore remnants of lessons' alphabet letters. Simple words, beginning arithmetic. Someone had carved their initials on a desk corner instead of bothering me. It felt like evidence of life. Thomas attended evening classes himself, though I'd noticed early on that he already read well. To encourage the hands, he'd said, but his presence felt like more than encouragement. He brought lamp oil when our supply ran low, built extra shelves for my overflow of books without asking. Never made a show of helping, just did it. A routine developed without discussion. After classes ended, he stayed to help stack slates while I wiped down the chalkboard. Sometimes he asked about next week's lesson plans. Sometimes I explained a new teaching method I wanted to try. Sometimes neither of us spoke, and the silence felt comfortable. Familiar, like a well-worn coat. I caught myself counting his footsteps outside the schoolhouse before class, recognizing his knock, missing evening classes when ranch demands kept him away. The awareness troubled me. This was an arrangement. Not romance, practicality, not sentiment. I warned myself constantly. Guard yourself. Don't hope. Hope leads to disappointment. But the warnings grew quieter each day. Spring arrived in earnest. I noticed it in the thawing ground, greening grass, evenings that stretched longer. Noticed it in myself, too, something frozen beginning to soften. I wasn't sure I wanted the thaw. Winter was safer. You couldn't be disappointed by crops that never got planted. The community shifted around me in small ways. Women invited me to their quilting circle. Men's families sent thank you gifts, fresh eggs, preserves, bread still warm from the oven. Children waved when they saw me in town. I was becoming part of something, not just teaching beside it. One evening, Marcus asked to read aloud the letter he'd written to his son. His hands shook, holding the paper, but his voice stayed steady. "Dear James, I hope this letter finds you well. I have learned to write, so I can tell you that I think of you every day. Your pa, Marcus." The room fell silent. 12 rough cowboys sat motionless, some blinking hard. Marcus folded the letter carefully, looked at me with eyes that held everything words couldn't express. Thomas caught my eye across the room. His smile said, "You did this." My heart answered, "We did." The distinction mattered. The we mattered more. After class, Thomas helped me close the shutters. Our hands brushed, reaching for the same latch. He didn't pull away. Neither did I. For 3 heartbeats, we stood there close enough to be more than teacher and rancher. Too careful to cross that distance. "Good night," he said finally. "Good night," I answered, both of us lying. There was nothing good about the loneliness of separate buildings. I wondered when I'd started leaving 2 coffee cups out in the cottage. Even when I lived alone, when I'd begun listening for wagon wheels on Friday evenings, when his presence had shifted from obligation to anticipation. Boston had taught me to be invisible a woman past her prime, past her prospects. Taking up space nobody wanted to give her. Here. Grown men asked my opinion. Women sought my guidance. And one quiet rancher looked at me like I mattered. The difference was dizzying. I thought about Mother sometimes, how she'd lived small, accepting whatever life offered rather than reaching for more. She'd loved Father. But after he died, she'd simply faded. I'd promised myself I'd never fade like that. Never need someone so much that losing them erased me, but maybe I'd overcorrected. Maybe I'd protected myself so well I'd forgotten how to be reached at all. Spring was arriving in the land and in me. I couldn't stop either one. Late spring brought rain. It pounded the schoolhouse roof during evening class, turned the yard to mud, made everything smell like earth and growth and possibility. After the students left, Thomas lingered to help clean chalkboards. Rain drummed steadily outside. Neither of us rushed. "Tell me about Boston," he said suddenly. "Your family." I deflected automatically. Nothing to tell. He waited, just stood there, patient as stone, until the silence stretched so long I had to fill it. "Mother died 2 years ago," I said finally. "Influenza. Distant cousins took me in because it was the right thing to do, not because they wanted me there. I could feel myself becoming a burden with every meal I ate, every room I occupied." The words came faster, spilling out like the rain outside. I spent 2 years teaching young girls who would all marry well while I aged past any prospect. I had no family, no position, no future. I was invisible. I turned away, appalled I'd revealed so much, braced for pity. "I built this ranch for a family I didn't have," Thomas said quietly. "Spent 10 years imagining a wife, children, life filling these empty rooms. Helped build that schoolhouse thinking someday there'd be students. We both constructed futures that didn't arrive." He paused. "Maybe that's why this feels different. We're building something that's actually here." I looked at him then. Really looked. Saw loneliness matching mine. Saw a man who'd built spaces hoping they'd fill with meaning. Only to discover you couldn't construct belonging. It had to grow. Rain fell harder. We stood in that empty schoolhouse, surrounded by slates and primers. Two people who'd learned that hope was dangerous. Trying to figure out if courage was enough. "I'd be honored if you'd consider marriage," he said. "Not as obligation, but as partnership. Two people building something real together." He didn't demand an answer, didn't pressure. Just offered the possibility and waited. "I need time," I whispered. "Take all you need. I'm not going anywhere." We stood in the doorway, watching rain sheet across the yard. Closer than we'd been. Not touching, but not separate either. Lightning flickered in the distance. Thunder followed, low and rumbling. "I spent so long being unnecessary," I said. "The thought of becoming necessary again terrifies me. What if I'm still insufficient? What if I let myself hope and everything crumbles?" "You transformed this town," Thomas answered. "Taught men to read who thought they never could. Built something from nothing. That's not insufficient. That's remarkable. But fear doesn't listen to logic. Fear remembers every rejection, every closed door, every time you weren't quite good enough. Boston had taught me I wasn't enough. How could Montana change that truth? We were the same. I realized. Both builders who'd constructed empty spaces, hoping they'd fill with meaning. But meaning doesn't arrive on schedule. It grows in unexpected soil, watered by unlikely rain. Maybe by lonely people finding each other, He walked me back to the cottage through mud and darkness. At my door, he paused. You don't have to decide tonight or this month. I'll wait as long as you need. I couldn't sleep that night. Through my window, I saw lamplight burning in his ranch house across the valley. 2 lonely people in separate buildings, both awake. Both wondering if courage was enough to bridge the distance we'd built to protect ourselves. I thought about what he'd said. Partnership, building something real together. Not rescue, not transaction. Partnership. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that was everything. Summer arrived with heat that made the schoolhouse feel like an oven. Attendance dropped as harvest demands increased. I understood families needed every hand, but discouragement crept in anyway. Then Mrs. Henderson brought news that froze the blood in my veins. Town council's meeting tonight, she said, setting tea down carefully. Some members are questioning the teacher funding. They're questioning how saying school money was meant for proper school, not cowboy night classes. She looked apologetic. There's talk of redirecting your salary. The guilt hit immediately. My failure to fill that classroom with children had created this conflict. I'd adapted rather than succeeded, bent the rules rather than following them. Now it was catching up. Thomas attended the meeting. I heard about it secondhand the next morning, how he'd argued passionately for continuing the program. How he'd defended not just the classes, but me, defended my work, my vision, my worth. Something shifted when I heard that. When had anyone fought for me, Mother had loved me. But she'd been too worn down by life to fight for anything. The Boston cousins had tolerated me, not championed me. Thomas barely knew me. Yet he'd stood before the town council and declared I mattered. The council scheduled a second meeting for the following week. This time, I didn't wait for an invitation. I walked into that room uninvited, past the startled faces of men who'd never expected a woman to insert herself into their deliberations. The council chairman, Mr. Porter, owner of the general store, looked ready to object. I'd like to speak, I said calmly. He hesitated. Mrs. Henderson, sitting in the back, nodded encouragingly. Let her talk. Gerald? I'd prepared all day. Not defensively, not apologetically. I presented facts. In 3 months, 12 men have learned to read and write. I began. They can now read contracts before signing them, write letters to distant family members. Calculate fair wages. 4 women can now manage household accounts independently. Children attend when they can, learning alongside adults that education doesn't end at childhood. I showed Marcus's letters, Mrs. Henderson's account books, Sarah Mitchell's household ledger. You built that schoolhouse for children who couldn't attend. I'm teaching the community you have, not the one you wished for. That's not failure. That's adaptation. The room stayed quiet. Then Marcus stood from the back. He'd come straight from the ranch, still wearing work clothes, hat in his hands. I'd like to say something, he announced. 3 months ago, I couldn't write my own name. Yesterday, I got a letter back from my son. First time in 3 years we've corresponded. Miss Thornton gave me that. His voice cracked. She gave me my boy back. Mrs. Henderson stood next, showed her bookkeeping, explained how she'd discovered a supplier had been overcharging her for years. I run my business better now, that's worth something. One by one, my students stood, testified to changed lives, defended me the way I'd taught them with evidence, with dignity, with confidence born from education. Thomas sat silent through it all. But I felt his support like solid ground beneath uncertain feet. The council voted 6 months continuation, conditional. But continued. I'd bought time. Proven worth to them, but more importantly, to myself. Standing before that council, defending my work, I'd stopped asking permission. Stopped apologizing for not being what they'd expected. I'd declared what I'd become a teacher who met people where they were. That woman didn't need anyone's validation. Walking home afterward, Thomas offered his arm. I took it, not from weakness, but from recognition that strength could be shared. "We'll make this work," I said. He answered quietly, "We already are." 3 months after the council vote, summer heat pressed down like a weight. Attendance dropped further. Harvest demanded everyone. I understood. But understanding didn't stop the doubt from creeping back. The note appeared on the schoolhouse door on a Tuesday morning. 8 words in crude handwriting, "Go back east where you belong." I stood there, reading it over and over, as if repetition might change the meaning. It didn't. Those 8 words resurrected every fear Boston had planted in me, every doubt, every certainty that I'd never be enough. I took the note back to my cottage, pulled out my trunk from under the bed, started packing. The logic felt sound. I could return to Boston, find factory work, live quietly, stop hoping, stop failing, stop trying to matter in a place that didn't want me. The note said what I'd always suspected: I didn't belong. Not in Boston. Not here. Not anywhere. I was a woman existing between worlds, never quite fitting either. I cataloged my inadequacies like counting coins. Too plain for real marriage. Too unconventional for proper teaching. Too Eastern for this Western town. Too uncertain for anything that required confidence. The old voice from Boston whispered, "You were never enough. Why did you think Montana would change that?" Thunder rumbled in the distance. Summer storm building. The temperature dropped suddenly, wind picking up, carrying the smell of rain. I walked to the schoolhouse through the first drops. Don't know why. Maybe to say goodbye to the space I'd briefly made my own. The door stood unlocked. I went inside, stood in the center of the room as rain began hammering the roof. Lightning illuminated everything the chalkboard covered in tomorrow's lesson plan. Shelves full of books being borrowed and returned, slates stacked from last week's class. Evidence everywhere that I'd built something real. So why couldn't I believe my own eyes? The rain soaked through my dress. I didn't care. I stood there cataloging proof against the note's cruelty. Marcus's shaking hand, writing his name. Mrs. Henderson's proud arithmetic. Sarah Mitchell's household ledger. Children finally attending when they could. Library plans forming. 6 months of transformation. One cruel note against 6 months of evidence. Why did the cruelty weigh more? Because I'd spent my life waiting to be chosen. Waiting to be necessary to someone. Waiting for permission to matter. But necessity wasn't a gift from others. It was a choice I made. I chose this place. These people. This work, fear of unworthiness, was old voice, not truth. The revelation came quiet, not dramatic. I'd been asking the wrong question. Not, do they need me, but am I willing to serve anyway? Not, do I belong, but will I choose to? Stay Thunder crashed directly overhead. The schoolhouse door banged open. Thomas stood there, soaked, holding a lantern that did nothing against the lightning. "What do you need?" he asked. Not if I was leaving. What I needed? I need to believe I matter here. I said, not as teacher hired, but as person choosing to stay. He crossed the room, set down the lantern, took my hands. You transformed this town. You transformed me. The question isn't whether you matter. It's whether you'll let yourself believe it. I'd spent years building walls against hurt, against disappointment, against hope. Standing in that storm-battered schoolhouse, I finally understood the walls hadn't protected me. They'd isolated me. I won't run from fear anymore, I said. I'll teach until they force me out, or I'm too old to write on chalkboards. And the other question, Thomas asked quietly, about us, I couldn't answer yet. Marriage meant vulnerability I wasn't quite ready for, but staying meant commitment. Choosing this place, this work, this possibility. "Ask me again in a month," I whispered. He nodded, didn't push, just walked me back through mud and clearing sky. Two people learning that courage came in stages. That transformation happened in increments, that sometimes the bravest thing was simply not running. I hadn't said yes to marriage, but I'd said yes to belonging. Sometimes that's the harder declaration. Early autumn painted the valley gold and red. My 6-month trial with the town council was nearly complete, but I'd stopped thinking about it as a trial. This was my life now, my choice. I'd been planning the library for weeks. The idea had grown from casual thought to consuming vision, a permanent town resource, open to everyone. Evidence of lasting commitment. I presented the proposal to Thomas one evening after class. "I want to build a town library. Students donate 1 book each. I'll write to contacts in Boston for more donations. Year-round resource. Open to all." He studied my sketched plans. "You're saying you're staying..." "I'm saying I'm building something permanent." "Yes, I'm staying." His smile could have lit the whole valley. "I have an empty building on the ranch. Good bones. Needs work. It could house a library." We spent the next week transforming that building. Thomas and his ranch hands cleared it out. Built shelves, whitewashed walls. I organized donated books, wrote letters east requesting more. We worked side by side, his strength, my vision, both necessary. The comfortable silences between us had changed, deepened. We'd moved beyond careful politeness into something richer. Partnership in action. On the 5th day, surrounded by books we were shelving together, I stopped, set down the volume I'd been holding, turned to face him. "Thomas?" He looked up from the shelf he was installing. My hands shook, but I pushed through. I spent my life waiting to be asked, waiting to be chosen. But partnership means choosing each other. I took a breath. "So I'm choosing you. Will you marry me?" He set down his tools carefully, crossed to where I stood, took both my hands in his calloused ones. "Yes," he said. "I've been waiting until you were ready. Didn't want you saying yes from gratitude or obligation. Wanted you to choose me the way I'd already chosen you. You chose me." The words came out whisper soft. "The day you agreed to teach those cowboys, the day you stood up to the town council, the day you stayed after that note." He touched my face gently. "I fell in love with your courage, your adaptability, your refusal to give up." We married the following week. Simple ceremony, Mrs. Henderson as witness, Marcus giving me away. Not because I needed giving, because he wanted to be part of the beginning we were building. The library opened 3 days later. 200 books on opening day donations from students, purchases from my savings, contributions from Thomas's ranch. Ranch hands had built beautiful shelves during off hours. Women had sewn curtains for the windows. Children had drawn pictures for the walls. Marcus was the first official borrower. He checked out a book to read with his son, who was visiting from back east. "Never thought I'd see this day," Marcus said, clutching the book like treasure. My boy and me, reading together. Children started attending school when they could not full-time, but flexibly. Parents who valued education wanted their children to value it too. The original vision of a classroom full of children hadn't been wrong, just incomplete. Real education meant meeting people where they were, adults at night, women in afternoons, children when possible. Flexibility wasn't compromise, it was wisdom. Thomas and I stood between the library and schoolhouse on opening day, watching people stream between both buildings, two structures with complementary purposes. Education wasn't about buildings, it was about transformation. I came to fill an empty schoolhouse. I said, filled the whole town instead, and the emptiness inside myself. He took my hand. That schoolhouse taught both of us something. Built it thinking we knew what we needed. Turned out we needed something completely different. Marcus raised his borrowed book in toast at the small gathering that evening. To the teacher who taught us we're never too old to begin. Everyone cheered. I looked around at faces I'd come to know. Cowboys who could now read their names. Women managing their own accounts. Children learning that education was a lifelong gift. A community transformed. I'd spent years believing my value came from others' needs. But watching the library fill, watching students grow, watching Thomas look at me with pride and love, I understood finally. My value came from what I chose to give, not what others chose to take. That distinction changed everything. Proposing to Thomas had been the bravest thing I'd ever done. Not because I feared rejection, but because I'd dared to claim what I wanted. All my life, I'd accepted what was offered, grateful for scraps. Marrying him meant reaching for more. Choosing partnership, choosing love, choosing a future I wanted instead of settling for a future available. The schoolhouse still stood, still waiting for full classrooms someday. But I'd learned the building mattered less than what happened inside it. We've been married 3 months now. I'm writing this from Thomas's ranch, our ranch, on a cold November evening. Snow falling outside, fire burning warm, coffee cups on the table we built together. The school program thrives. 30 adult students now, 8 children attending flexibly. Library circulation numbers that would make any librarian proud, but those are just statistics. The real measure is different. Marcus corresponds regularly with his son, who's planning to move west next spring. Want to be near Pa? He wrote, "Now that we're talking again, Mrs. Henderson manages the boarding house books and teaches arithmetic to new ranchers' wives. She's better at it than I am, has a gift for making numbers. Makes sense." The first ranch hand contracts negotiated by literate workers happened last month. Fair wages, clear terms, men who understood what they were signing. That's power. That's transformation. A town newspaper started last week, run by a 45-year-old cowboy who learned to read in my evening class. His first editorial was about the value of adult education. I measure success differently now. Not by Boston standards proper classrooms, obedient students, traditional methods. I measure by letters written, contracts understood, women empowered, community transformed, better metrics. Truer ones? My transformation feels just as profound. I arrived as a lonely Boston schoolmarm with one trunk and low expectations. I've become wife, teacher, community builder, woman who knows her worth, woman who chose her path, woman who built her belonging. Thomas and I built our marriage the way we built the library, with patience, shared purpose, mutual respect. No dramatic declarations, just steady accumulation of shared moments, shared work, shared future. Love wasn't a lightning strike. It was a lamp lit every evening, coffee made every morning, hand reached for on cold walks home. This morning I taught afternoon class. Sarah Mitchell brought her oldest daughter, who's learning to read alongside her mother. Watching 3 generations learn together, grandmother Mrs. Henderson, Mother Sarah, daughter Emma. I understood something fundamental. Education doesn't end. It multiplies. Next year, we're starting formal children's school, May through September when families can spare them. Year-round adult education continues. I'm training 2 women as assistant teachers. Building legacy, not just filling time. I'd spent so long being invisible. Boston taught me to accept whatever space people allowed me. The West taught me to create my own space, to adapt, to build, to matter, not because someone needed me, but because I chose to serve. Meeting people where they are, not where you wish they were, creates lasting change. I learned it in teaching, learned it in love, learned it in building a life I never imagined, but can't imagine leaving. The woman who stepped off that stagecoach uncertain, defensive, prepared for disappointment feels like a stranger now. I've become the person I needed to meet all along. The West didn't make me that woman. I did. With help from a town that needed me as much as I needed it. Tonight, Thomas and I will walk from the library to the schoolhouse to home. All 3 buildings lit with lamps, all filled with purpose, filled with life we chose to build together. Tomorrow morning I'll teach again. Adults learning letters, children learning numbers. A community learning that transformation is always possible if you're willing to meet people where they are. Sometimes the woman doing the teaching learns more than anyone she instructs. I'd taught literacy. The West taught me belonging. Fair trade, I thought. Walking home with my husband through first snow. Better than fair, perfect.